Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's segment of the Caissons Go Rolling Along. This week we're talking about the history of American military uniforms. We just finished talking for the last couple of weeks about personal weapons. And before that we talked about field rations that soldiers carried. So this is, what did they carry them in? And that is the pockets of their uniforms. But what kind of uniforms did they wear? So as veterans, you all know, you've all worn uniforms, and you've probably worn all different types of uniforms, you know, your dress uniform, the field uniform, fatigues, combat, all these different uniforms, but that's a relatively new thing. Back in the 19th century, and even in the 18th century, soldiers were generally issued one uniform, or sometimes two, one for warmer weather and one for colder weather. Of course now, soldiers get different types of gear for all different types of weather, and not just two versions of everything, but usually multiple versions of things. But in the 18th and 19th century, for one thing, people didn't have as many choices of clothing, and also clothing was more expensive, and it was harder for the government to supply it to the troops. But starting in early America, during the Revolutionary War, the U.S. Army uniform was modeled on the British Army uniform. Remember, some of our officers, right, had served in the British Army under the King, and they essentially, the Continental Army wore a blue coat as opposed to the red coat that was worn by the British, and they were known as the Redcoats. And it distinguished it from the uniform worn by other militaries. In addition, they had white overalls and waistcoats that were worn with the uniforms. Typically, the clothes that they wore were tight-fitting, what were called small clothes. In other words, they didn't give you a lot of extra room. These were waistcoats and breeches, which were pants. Jackets with tight-fitting sleeves were popular at the time. Now, these didn't always make the best uniforms because it was not always so easy to move around in tight-fitting clothing. That was the style. In general, each soldier was outfitted in a wool regimental coat with linen small clothes in the spring. So this is the spring. In the spring, they would give them a wool regimental coat. So you can imagine how hot that was during the spring and the summer. But that's what their coats were made out of. And they also got a wool regimental coat with woolen small clothes in the fall. Small clothes were the things that they wore underneath the coat, which were the pants and the shirt and these other appurtenances that they wore. The uniform was blue with colored facings, depending on the region. So if the soldiers were from New England, and if they were in regiments that were from the Northeast, they had white facings. In other words, when you open the lapel of the blue jacket, on the inside it was white. And if they were from the mid-Atlantic area, they were red. And if they were from the South, they were blue. So even the Continental Army had different partial colors of the uniforms depending on where they came from. And these were according to the regulations that were issued in 1779. The musicians in the Army wore reverse-colored uniform coats. So in other words, the musicians might have a white coat on the outside and blue on the inside to distinguish them from the regular soldiers. And this was except for the generals and the staff officers, and they had blue coats with red stripes, which became standard in 1782. In terms of uniforms, the year 1812 was a little bit of a mess. So we're fast forwarding now to the next war, which is the War of 1812. During the winter of 1812 and 1813, they wore something called a coatee, which was an outer coat, and they were made of a drab black, brown, or gray cloth. These were provided to several regular Army infantry units because they had a shortage of blue cloth. They were produced in the same manner, and they had red cuffs and collars, just as when you flip them open. And in most cases, they had a white binding. Except a couple of the infantry regiments got blue coats with red cuffs. The white binding was abandoned entirely in February of 1813. The uniform regulations were changed again in May of 1813. The new uniform was single-breasted instead of a double-breasted jacket. It featured a 10-button front closure, so that's a lot of buttons. For infantry and artillery, the red collar and cuffs were eliminated, and the lace binding was confined to either white or yellow. The regulations also included a new cap, or shako, which was modeled after the British infantry's Belgic-style cap. Now, in the Revolutionary period, sometimes they wore what was called a tricorner, right, which was the three-cornered hat. Sometimes the brim on one side would be pinned up. But the Belgic-style cap was a little bit different. It looked kind of more like what some of the early naval officers wore. The uniform remained in use until the 1820s with very small changes. Now remember also the Army was pretty small in the early part of the 19th century. Especially after the War of 1812 was over and a lot of volunteers went home, the Army remained very, very small. And he keeps that, takes it. And the Army remained very small until the next major conflict, which was the Mexican War in 1846. Between 1833 and 1850, in the mid-19th century, the uniform requirements changed again in response to changes in the Army structure. So in 1833, there was a new regulation, and it established a standard coatee that was similar to its predecessors. For privates, it was single-breasted with 9 buttons in the front, and it had lace on the collar. You can imagine an Army uniform with lace on the collar. But remember, in the 19th century, especially for officers, they had to dress like gentlemen, even on the battlefield. So they had this lace collar, and they had worsted epaulets that replaced the earlier shoulder wings, and the buttons were of a new pattern. So they actually began to have the stamped military buttons. Most of them had an eagle. Sometimes they had a shield on them. Especially during the Civil War, there were more different types of buttons depending on the state regiment, and because the states generally were the ones that outfitted the soldiers with the uniforms, although they had to meet, especially in the North, in the Union Army, they had to meet certain basic Army specifications. Infantry wool lace remained white, whereas artillery wool lace remained yellow. So this was a piece of trim on the uniform. The artillery soldiers had yellow ones and infantry soldiers had white ones. During the Civil War, they would change that. Artillery soldiers usually had red piping on the edges of their uniform jackets and a red stripe down the side of their pants. And that's how they could be distinguished from infantry soldiers. Yellow lace was also given to the new Dragoon Regiment. So the Dragoon Regiment was a cavalry regiment. Although branch insignia was created, the metal color remained yellow for mounted soldiers and white for foot troops. An eagle with a hunting horn for infantry and an eagle with crossed gun tubes for artillery were among the new branch insignia approved in 1833. A bimetal insignia of a yellow federal eagle on a white metal sunburst was given to the Light Dragoons Regiment. So these were metal appurtenances that were attached to the uniforms, metal insignia, and they began to devise different insignia for different types of troops. So those also could distinguish. Later it would be the crossed rifles, which would indicate infantry. There would be artillery artillery were usually crossed cannon. There were little, kind of looked like castle turrets, which indicated engineers. Cavalry usually had a different type of insignia. Signal Corps had an insignia which was usually two flags or pinafores which were crossed. So there was usually each branch of the Army had its own different type of uniform insignia. And of course the Navy always had a different insignia. And when the Air Force came along later, it had a different insignia as well. By the time of the Mexican-American War in 1845, the U.S. Army uniform had undergone yet another transformation. Soldiers started wearing roundabouts made primarily of blue wool. In addition, the pants would have yellow vertical stripes and chevrons on the sleeves to indicate their rank. So this is where the sleeve ranking came into play, and that is, usually one stripe for private, two for corporal, three for sergeant, and then officers would have shoulder boards that would indicate their rank as well. The Army also switched to 4-inch folding caps in place of tombstone caps. So the cap style changed also. And the 4-inch cap remained popular all the way through the Civil War and well through the rest of the 19th century as part of the Army uniform. In the mid-19th century, in 1851, a new uniform requirement established a system of branch colors and chevrons. The uniforms developed under the 1851 regulations were only in use for a short time, but the alterations were crucial for the Army. The frock coat was approved as the standard service uniform for all soldiers, obviating the need for the coatee. So the frock coat now, which was ubiquitous during the Civil War, became the standard outer part of the uniform. Prussian blue for infantry, orange for dragoons, scarlet for artillery, green for mounted rifles, and black for staff were introduced as branch colors. This would change by the time of the Civil War. Nobody was wearing orange anymore because you'd be a moving target if you were wearing that. But pretty much the Prussian blue became the standard for all branches of the Army during the Civil War, except the green for mounted rifles was actually retained for a few units, primarily of sharpshooters, who wore green uniforms, even during the Civil War, when the entire Union Army was a sea of blue. In fact, the Confederates often referred to Union soldiers as blue bellies because of their blue uniforms. But there were some units, elite units of federal sharpshooters, who wore green uniforms during the Civil War. Soldiers' uniforms during the American Civil War differed from those used during the Mexican-American War. They began wearing brass branch insignia to show off their regiments. So a soldier would have a brass insignia that would have the number of his regiment. So if a soldier was in the 39th New York Regiment, he would have a little insignia with 39, usually worn on the collar or somewhere on the upper part of the uniform. There was usually a corps regiment, depending on what corps. His regiment was part of a brigade. The brigade was part of a division. Well, his regiment was part of a brigade. The brigade was part of a division. The division was part of a corps. That corps had its own insignia, and that insignia was usually worn on the cap. Depending on which corps you were in, you had a different cap insignia. Soldiers began wearing, and they had a frock coat with branch piping for foot troops, uniform coats with branch-colored lace for mounted troops, sky blue trousers, and different hats were put into service. Now, there wasn't a uniform across the board hat during the Civil War. The most common hat was really the cap, the 4-inch cap. It was worn primarily by enlisted men, although a lot of officers wore them also. But there was also, a lot of soldiers wore a a large felt hat with a brim. And sometimes enlisted men wore those as well. Famously, the first Corps, which was commanded by General John Reynolds, who was killed at Gettysburg, and they were one of the first federal units onto the field in the Battle of Gettysburg, they were known as the Black Hats, because they did not wear forage caps, but they wore these big, kind of somewhat floppy black felt hats with large brims, like a fedora. Some soldiers would pin one side of the hat up to the top of the hat with a pin, and some soldiers wore them open. A lot of times they had a band around the top part of the hat, and many soldiers would put feathers inside of those bands. The hat would have the Corps insignia attached to the hat, just like the forage caps did. So some units chose to wear these different types of headgear because that was a way of distinguishing themselves. And the Army did not require them to use a specific, to use only one type of headgear, although the uniform itself had to meet Army standards. So even though these sky blue trousers and different hats were put into service, soldiers wore a wide range of uniforms according to the nature of the conflict. And again, remember that the piping on the uniform sometimes differed depending on the type of unit that it was. Infantry, artillery wore different. Artillery usually had the red piping or the red stripe on the uniform. Cavalry sometimes had a different insignia as well. In the late 19th century, after the Civil War, the Army made some considerable alterations based on field experience and recommendations. This time they chose something called the Swiss blouse, which had been recommended by an Army surgeon named Alexander Woodhull for field service. It had 4 pleats down each side of the front, from the shoulders to the bottom of the shirt, and it made it, it kind of made it stand out. You know, the shirt made it stand out. The pleats were revolutionary in that they introduced the concept of layering. And in cold weather, the coat was loose enough to be worn with up to 3 shirts and a waistcoat, while still allowing ease of movement. So that was how they dealt with the cold weather issue, was these pleated shirts allowed them to wear multiple shirts because the pleats can be either opened or closed. And they tailored the coat so they would be big enough, loose enough to accommodate all of these other clothes underneath. And so this was a different way, kind of an innovative way of dealing with the necessity of wearing more clothing during cold weather. In the early 20th century, the U.S. Army issued a wide variety of rank and branch and specialist insignia on both bright and drab bronze colored for full dress and drab or bronze colors for field uniforms. So this is where the uniforms began to take on more of a sense of camouflage. You know, in the 19th century, Army uniforms did not blend in with the surroundings, right? So the soldiers stood out from the surroundings. This was not always a good thing if you were being shot at, because it meant that it was easier for the enemy to see you. But somebody thought it was a good idea to dress a soldier in clothing that would kind of make him blend in a little bit with the surroundings, make it a little more difficult to distinguish him from the grass, the trees, the shrubs, the bushes, and the other things around. And that was where colors like olive drab and green and even brown, you know, like khaki and other shades of brown came into style as being part of an Army field uniform. Not a dress uniform, but a uniform you would wear in the field. So next time we're going to talk a little bit about those uniforms, beginning with the early 20th century, Spanish-American War, World War I, and then the evolution of the uniform after that into World War II and other conflicts up to modern times. But and also a little bit about, you know, what distinguished these uniforms from just regular clothing, the different things they had in them, like the types of pockets that enabled soldiers to carry their gear and other things that they needed with them more efficiently. So I'll see you next week, I hope, when the caissons go rolling along.